Welcome to the Wisconsin Podcast. I'm Greg Sauer. On this podcast, we talk Wisconsin things, everything from media, sports, culture, politics, and more. Today's guest is Wisconsin author Mark O'Connell. He'll be appearing at the upcoming Wisconsin Book Festival to talk about his book, The Close Encounters Man, How One Man Made the World Believe in UFOs. The book is a biography of noted astronomer, educator, and UFO investigator, Dr. J. Allen Hynek. Hynek is a key figure in the history of the UFO phenomenon and invented the concept of close encounters with alien life that inspired the title of Steven Spielberg's classic science fiction movie, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. But Hynek was also an ingenious scientist and beloved professor at Northwestern University. In the book, O'Connell explores all aspects of Hynek's incredibly interesting life, which stretched from 1910 to 1986. Whether you're a skeptic or you want to believe, the book is definitely worth a read. In addition to authoring the book, O'Connell is a screenwriter, teacher, and blogger. He wrote episodes for Star Trek: The Next Generation and Star Trek: Deep Space Nine. I spoke with him by phone earlier this month. Here's our chat. Well, I did this week. I did catch some of your late night radio appearance on Midnight in the Desert.
Oh, good.
And I've seen you've been on like some other paranormal type podcasts, talk shows, and stuff. And
lots of them. Yeah.
And I mean, I'm just kind of like, it's not really a world that I drift into very much. So I'm just kind of like wondering, since you're kind of in that world, are there a lot of shows like this that I don't know about? Is there like this underground community that I don't know about?
Yes, there's an amazing amount. I thought I had a pretty good idea how big this field was before the book came out, but since the book came out and I've been doing all these interviews, I've just been blown away by the sheer number of podcasts and web radio shows dealing specifically with UFOs and the paranormal. It's just amazing. There are so many people doing this. And, they all apparently seem to be doing it successfully. So it seems like there's no limit to the size of the market or the appetite of people who are fascinated, by these topics.
Well, why do you think it is such a culture? Why is there such a big culture around UFOs in the country, do you think?
I think a lot of it has to do with, there are people who have UFO experiences, and then there are people who are interested in UFOs, okay? And I think those two groups have a lot in common. And one of the things that I think ties them together is that they want to know that other people think the same way, believe the same things, have had similar experiences. And so that creates this big virtual community of UFO enthusiasts and UFO witnesses. And it's a surprisingly large audience, as I said before, and a lot of people. I don't know if you knew this, but in addition to all the writing, I've also spent about 5 years with this group called MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network, which I worked as a volunteer field investigator. So for 5 years, I was investigating UFO reports in Wisconsin, and one of the big surprises of that work was that very often the people I would interview who had filed a UFO report, the only reason they had filed that report was they weren't interested in attention, they weren't, they didn't have egos involved, they simply wanted to know, has anybody else seen this same thing? And if so, can you tell me what it is? So I think a lot of the core of this community is sort of a mutual reassurance that, no, you're not crazy. I've seen it too. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Did that work kind of lead you into this book eventually?
Yeah, kind of hand in hand. In 2011, I decided to start writing a UFO blog, more or less just to entertain myself. I needed to find some topic that I would be happy to write about several times a week. And UFOs really seemed to be the one topic that could hold my interest and I'd be interested in blogging about, on an ongoing basis. So I started sort of a semi-tongue-in-cheek UFO blog called High Strangeness, and that's at highstrangenessufo.com. And when you start doing this sort of thing, you just have this incredible need for new material. So I was constantly online looking for interesting new UFO stories or UFO personalities or anything to write about in the blog. And I came across two things. The first thing was I came across the website for this organization, MUFON, and at the bottom of the screen there was a little button that said, "Become a certified UFO field investigator." And, the light bulb went on above my head. I was like, oh my gosh, how come I never thought of this before? This is perfect. This is what I can blog about on an ongoing basis. So that became a big part of it. I decided it would be really valuable to do this investigation work as a means of understanding what goes on in the mind of someone who has seen a UFO and who has decided to report that sighting. So that was kind of the first part of it. Then I also found a website for the J. Allen Hynek Center for UFO Studies in Chicago. And I was living part-time in Chicago at the time because my wife worked there. And so here I discovered that this UFO Research Foundation, founded by one of the heroes of the UFO of the UFO community, is actually just a few miles from where I live, and it's still in business. So I started hanging out there. I wheedled an invitation from the scientific director there and started hanging out. It turns out Dr. Hynek's archives are just a bunch of files and bookshelves in a couple basements in Chicago. So, but I started hanging out there and looking for more material for my blog. And on one of those visits, Mark Rodiger, who's the scientific director of the Center for UFO Studies, said, "Hey, I've read your blog. I like it. We've always been looking for someone to write the definitive account of Dr. Hynek's career. Would you be interested?" And I said, "Yeah, I would love to do that. I would love to be the writer who gets that job." So that's how it all came together. And so that's how writing the blog shifted to writing the book.
And for people who don't know, who was Allen Hynek?
Okay, well, this is why I knew him, because I've been interested in the UFO phenomenon ever since I was a little kid. Seriously, since I was about 3 years old, I've been totally into aliens and spaceships and UFOs. Dr. Hynek is probably the best-known UFO researcher ever, because he started out in 1947 when the so-called modern era of UFOs began in the United States, and the Air Force found itself on the receiving end of hundreds, if not thousands, of UFO reports from around the country. Just out of the blue in 1947, this phenomenon just erupted out of nowhere. The Air Force had no idea what to do with these reports, but they knew that the American public was nervous about it. People were nervous about strange things in the sky that the Air Force couldn't explain. So the Air Force was desperate to debunk these sightings and explain them away as perfectly ordinary things. So in order to do that, they needed the backing of a serious, level-headed scientist. Well, Dr. Hynek was an astronomer who taught at The Ohio State University. That's what he was doing in the 1940s, and the Air Force, they housed their UFO study group out of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. So Hynek was working literally right up the highway from the Air Force's UFO project. He had already done a lot of government contract work during and after World War II, so he was a known quantity. So the Air Force folks who were looking into the UFO phenomenon approached Hynek and said, we'd like to hire you to go over these hundreds of UFO reports we're getting and let us know which ones are simple misidentifications of celestial objects. Would you do that for us? And Hynek jumped at the chance. It was an easy way to make some extra money. He thought he would be promoting good science. He thought the UFO phenomenon was just a silly fad that would die out in no time. Well, he was wrong about that. It didn't die out. And when he realized it wasn't dying out, he became more interested, and he sort of became the voice of UFO research for many, many years. First as sort of a figurehead for the Air Force, and then later on his own. And he is, if people who know of him most likely know of him from his development of the Close Encounters classification system for UFO events, which translated into the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind, which Hynek was involved in. So that's sort of his claim to fame, is being involved in the Spielberg movie.
Yeah, talk about that movie a little bit and his kind of his communications with Steven Spielberg when Spielberg was developing that movie, and I believe Hynek had a small cameo in that movie. Talk about a little bit about that movie and some of the interplay that went on between Hynek and Spielberg.
It was a very fun part of the story to research. When I mentioned before that Dr. Hynek's archives now are in a couple basements in Chicago. Well, in one of those basements, I opened up a file drawer labeled letter S, and two folders just jumped out at me in this drawer. One said Sagan, and one said Spielberg. So I grabbed the Spielberg folder, opened it up, and the first thing I find is this incredibly awkward letter, a copy of a letter that Dr. Hynek had written to Steven Spielberg in about, it's either 75 or 1976, in which he says, hey, Mr. Spielberg, I understand that you're using my terminology as the title for your movie. I sure wish I had found out about this directly from you. We need to talk. So I'm reading this letter, and my jaw just hits the floor. Wow, did Steven Spielberg steal the title of his movie from Dr. Hynek? I thought that letter was just sensational. And then the next document in the folder was a return letter from Steven Spielberg to J. Allen Hynek saying, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. We did not mean to rip you off. We didn't realize this term belonged to you. And don't worry, because we're not going to call it the movie that. After all, we're going to call it Watching the Skies. And by the way, your book and Hynek had published his first book in 1972 in which he introduced the Close Encounters terminology. So Spielberg closes by saying, everyone on my creative team is now required to read your book as, basic research for working on this movie. So you've got these two incredibly awkward letters exchanged between these two men. And I really couldn't wait to see where that story led to. Well, what it led to was they worked it all out. They were both grown-ups about it. They worked it all out. Steven Spielberg hired Dr. Hynek. Well, first of all, bought the rights to the title to use in the movie, because he ended up obviously using that as the movie's title after all. He bought the rights to dramatize the UFO incidents that Hynek had described in his book. And he hired Hynek to be technical consultant on the movie, which meant that Hynek would be hired for no more than 3 days to be paid $500 a day to be on set at the soundstage in Alabama where they were shooting much of the movie. And so both men got what they wanted. Steven Spielberg got to have the nation's #1 UFO expert sort of backing his movie, and Hynek, Hynek got to be sort of established as a pop culture figure. Not only did he get his name in the title in the credits of the movie and supply the title of the movie, but as you mentioned, he was in a 6-second cameo role. He had a 6-second movie career, and it takes place for anyone who remembers the movie. And it was just re-released last month as part of its 40th anniversary celebration. So maybe some of your listeners saw it just a month ago. But the whole final act of the movie takes place at this top-secret UFO landing base, hidden at the base of Devil's Tower in Wyoming. And there's a moment in the climax when the gigantic alien mothership appears, and there's this shot where all of these hundreds of technicians and scientists in their white lab coats are kind of holding back. They're kind of backing away from this immense, scary mothership. And in the midst of them, this one guy who looks like a college professor wearing, the tweed sport coat and holding the pipe and stroking his goatee, he just sort of comes surging forward through this crowd of engineers and scientists as though he belongs there. He's the only person moving towards the mothership, which I think is kind of a really neat moment for Hynek. And then the scene is over. It, like I said, it lasts 6 seconds, but but it had a huge effect on Hynek's career and his stardom. I guess you can call it that.
Now, I want to get to that other folder in the S folder, the second folder, but I'll wait for that for a little bit later, because I want to kind of establish a little bit about like him as an astronomer, because I think even if you don't have this aspect of his career about UFO, the study of UFOs, I think he's an incredibly interesting person anyways. I think there's a biography here anyways. I don't know if you felt like that as well, but can you kind of talk a little bit about some of his contributions to science and kind of how ingenious of a kind of researcher he was?
Oh yeah, and you're right. That was actually one of the big reasons I wanted to write this book, was because I didn't want it to just be about his UFO work. He had a really fascinating career as an astronomer that nobody knows anything about and nobody's ever written about, and I really wanted to correct that. What really fascinated me about Dr. Hynek was the fact that he had these two careers. Well, three careers, really: scientist, educator, and UFO researcher. And I was really curious to learn how those different career tracks intertwined and informed each other. And it turned out there were a lot of ways in which they really did. There were a lot of ways in which his scientific research gave him insights into the UFO field, and vice versa, in these really, really strange ways. So yeah, he got his PhD in astrophysics from the University of Chicago. In fact, he earned it working in Wisconsin at the Yerkes Observatory in Williams Bay, Wisconsin, overlooking Lake Geneva. If you've never been there, if you're interested in astronomy or science, it's a wonderful place to visit. Beautiful, beautiful building. That's where Hynek did his graduate work. And he became fascinated in studying the spectra of stars. If you can use a spectroscope, will break apart the light emitted by a star and reveal the chemical composition of the star. So Hynek became really fascinated with this branch of astronomy, and he became really well known for his work in spectroscopy. And so that led to all sorts of really interesting contract work for the U.S. government. He was not drafted in the Army in World War II, but drafted to join the scientific work at Johns Hopkins in Maryland to develop what they called the proximity fuse, which was a fuse in warheads and missiles that would send out radio waves in advance, and they would bounce back from the target and let the explosives detonate within a certain proximity of the target. Made life much safer for gunnery officers in the military. They didn't always have to score a bullseye to get a hit. And it saved a lot of lives, and it was really kind of the first smart weapon. So Hynek was involved in that. After World War II, he became involved in all sorts of fascinating projects. When the U.S. brought over a whole lot of the ex-Nazi rocketry scientists and some of the surplus V-2 rockets that we managed to get out of Germany, Hynek had a job helping to determine the payloads of those rockets when they were sent into space. Because they were used to do astronomical and atmospheric testing. So that's when Hynek really got into the possibilities of high-altitude astronomy, which led him to develop a project where he tried to launch a telescope in a high-altitude balloon 15 miles high to try to get stable images of celestial objects without the interference of the Earth's atmosphere. And I make the case in my book that was a direct predecessor to the Hubble Space Telescope. In my opinion, Dr. Hynek really created the whole science of high altitude or orbital astronomy observation. So lots and lots of fascinating things going on. And then, of course, there's the Sputnik story.
Yeah, and that's kind of one of the first moments, big moments, where maybe the public became aware of Dr. Hynek in 1957 when the Soviet Union launched the satellite. How did he kind of become kind of notorious, or why did he become kind of the guy that the media kept sticking microphones in front of his face talking about that?
As in so many things in his career, he was the guy who was in the right place at the right time. He had been hired by the Harvard Smithsonian Observatory to develop the world's first global satellite tracking system. This was part of the International Geophysical Year. The United States had vowed to put the first artificial satellite into Earth orbit as part of this global event. And Hynek was chosen to develop the tracking system by which we would observe and keep track of this satellite as it flew around in orbit. And what an interesting position to be put in for a scientist. He's being asked to develop a process to measure and observe something that nobody knows is even possible yet. In 1957, nobody had any idea that we could actually get a rocket off the ground and up into space. There were a lot of doubters, a lot of skeptics, and Hynek just went into it with both eyes open and said, no, we're going to make this work. So he developed this global tracking system in anticipation of the United States launching the very first satellite. And then the Soviet Union beat us to it. In fact, we just passed the 50th anniversary of it just a couple days ago, the launch of Sputnik. And when the news broke that the Russians had actually beat us to the punch and launched the first satellite, J. Allen Hynek was literally the only scientist at his desk who knew anything about satellites, who could answer the reporters' questions. So it took place on a Friday night. Hynek and his assistant were the last people to leave the office at Harvard for the weekend. And the phone rings just before they leave, and it's a reporter saying, hey, we just got this wire service story that the Russians launched a satellite. And Hynek was just shell-shocked. This was not supposed to happen. But he was, as I said, literally the only scientist at his desk, and so he became the epicenter of news coverage of the Sputnik launch, and it became his job over the ensuing days and weeks to really reassure the American public that, no, we are not under attack. No, this thing cannot hurt us. It's just a little metal ball in space. And so Hynek became kind of a scientific celebrity. Got his picture on the cover of Life magazine. It was really a big thing. Not only to just be recognized, but to be so trusted by so many Americans was a pretty amazing accomplishment.
So it seems throughout his career, there are these problems that people have, and they all kind of like, who should we call? It's Dr. Hynek. And another big problem that kind of came his way was when the military was trying to figure out UFOs. So how did he kind of become? What was the evolution of him as kind of becoming the UFO guy?
Well, as I said, the Air Force contacted him in 1947 and said, would you please work for us to help us debunk these UFO sightings? And Hynek happily took the job. But once he took the job, something interesting started happening. He got through the entire stack of UFO reports that the Air Force had given him, and he had managed to successfully identify a great deal of them as, well, this person obviously just saw Venus. This person obviously just saw a comet or a meteor. So he was able to explain away most of these sightings in a very credible way. But there was a residue of about 20% of the cases that he simply could not explain. And that didn't bother him at the time because he believed that given enough time and resources, they could get to the bottom of those other 20% of the cases and explain those away as well. So that wasn't really a problem for him at the time. Well, that initial contract ran out. Hynek went back to teaching, kind of forgot all about the UFO problem for 3 or 4 years. And in 1952, 5 years after the Air Force first approached Hynek, they come knocking on his door again. And they say, well, this is kind of embarrassing, but we still have this UFO problem. And we'd like you to come back and do what you did before, help us explain them away. And Hynek is just stunned by this news. He predicted in 1947 that this was just a fad and that it would die off. And here it is 5 years later, and it has not died off. In fact, it's gotten worse. The Air Force is getting more UFO reports than ever. It's a constant source of embarrassment for the Air Force. They're in complete denial. They try to debunk all the reports. And after 5 years, the American public and the American media had gotten wise to this and started thinking, hey, there's something not right about the way the Air Force is handling this. There's obviously something more to it. So the Air Force is in a jam. They come back to Hynek. They get him back on board. And once Hynek gets over the shock of discovering that UFO reports are still a thing, and he starts to do his analysis of the reports that have come in over the previous 5 years, and he discovers another shocker. There still are 20% of these cases that can't be explained. And as a scientist, Hynek always looked for patterns and consistencies in things. So when he sees that there, in these 5 years of reports, there's this consistent pattern of 20% of the cases being unexplainable, that makes his antenna go up. And he thinks, okay, there's something interesting here. I shouldn't be so dismissive of this phenomenon because I think there's something interesting going on here. I don't know what, but I'd like to find out. So that was kind of what triggered Hynek's journey from skeptic to open-minded. People sometimes call him a true believer. I wouldn't go that far because it was always a little nebulous what he actually believed. But he did go from a skeptic to an open-minded, curious approach to the phenomenon and a determination to study it in a scientific manner. Of course, the Air Force was not interested in a scientific study of UFOs. They just wanted the UFOs to go away. So that led to Hynek's sort of decades-long, uncomfortable relationship with the Air Force and with UFO enthusiasts who really for a long time, and many still do, just see Hynek as a sellout because of his work for the Air Force.
Fast forward a little bit later on in his life, he starts doing a lot of public appearances, a lot of interviews, television shows on the subject. And I'm kind of just like curious what his public perception, or what do you think the public's perception of him was later on in those years after he had done decades of research on UFOs. He's done decades of work in astronomy. What was kind of the public's reaction to him as a public figure on television and in the media?
The public had a very interesting relationship with Hynek because they hung on his every word in a lot of cases, and at the same time, a whole lot of people just distrusted him. And again, it goes back to his 20-year association with the Air Force, in which he was, officially a debunker, but under cover of pretending to be a debunker, he was actually promoting greater awareness and greater understanding and more meticulous study of the phenomenon. So Hynek kind of drove the public crazy in a lot of ways, because they couldn't tell whose side he was on. And in a way, he wasn't really on anyone's side. He was just trying to remain scientifically detached and open-minded. That was the way he processed things. So the public admired him, they respected him, they hung on his every word, but at the same time, a lot of them were just intensely frustrated with him for what they saw as him just not taking a stand. I don't see him that way at all. In the research I did on him, I discovered that he actually did take a great many really risky stands for a scientist. It's not always recognized because people are just so locked into, the conventional wisdom about the man. But, for all that confusion and ambivalence among the public, he always had a huge following, and people always wanted to know what he had to say and what he was thinking about UFOs. So even when he drove people nuts with his failure to take a position, people still wanted to know what he thought.
And I think that it goes to show, you write several times about his relationship to the students at Northwestern University and how popular he was on campus. Can you talk a little bit about how he was viewed on the campus of his home institution? Oh yeah,
in fact that I can sort of launch into that by telling a little bit about the research I did at Northwestern. In the archives at the Deering Library on campus. The archivists at Northwestern were just fantastic. I would go into the archives to spend a day doing research, and every once in a while, one of the archivists would come up to me and say, "Hey, Mark, we have this new thing. That, I found something. I came across something that I think you might be interested in for your book." And one of these times, the big event, the big announcement was that they had just digitized their entire run of the Daily Northwestern campus newspaper. And Kevin Leonard, the head archivist, is giving me this news while I'm in the archive rooms, and he says, let me look up Hynek's name. And he does a search for Hynek's name in this database of the campus newsletter. And he said, oh, Hynek's name comes up about 385 times. So Hynek was really well known at on Northwestern campus. He was constantly being talked about in the campus newspaper. His classes were enormously popular because people just liked him. He was a fun professor. He would come in at the beginning. He would come in the first day of class and write his name Hynek on the chalkboard and say, "My name is Hynek," as in giraffe, which I thought was pretty funny. And he had a streaker come into his classroom once. That's a fun story that I tell in the book that the head archivist remembered. He was there in the class when it happened. A streaker, not just any streaker though, but a streaker who had painted his entire body in green paint and wore some rubber space alien mask and scuba flippers, and then came flip-flopping into the lecture hall. So yeah, Hynek was very, very popular, and part of that I think was because he made so many public appearances. There was a lot of pride among the Northwestern campus community in the fact that they had this professor who was not only outspoken about a topic that a lot of scientists were reluctant to talk about, but he was getting out there on some really big shows. He was on national talk shows constantly, national TV shows, national radio shows. He was a really, really popular figure and an immense source of pride. Even when the Northwestern administration wasn't always comfortable with Hynek's UFO work, Hynek was always immensely popular on campus and really, really well loved.
You mentioned earlier that one of the reasons you wanted to write this book was to kind of reconcile his kind of various parts of his sides of his life. You know, the astronomy part, the science part, and his work on UFOs, and also kind of being an educator. Did you have a sense of which one of those sides of his life he enjoyed the most?
I would have a hard time. I would have a hard time answering that question because I think he loved them. I think he loved them all. He went into teaching against the advice of his doctoral advisor in the 1930s because teaching would give him greater autonomy, he thought, than any other profession for an astronomer. He could focus on the type of research he wanted to do as a teacher. And over time, he just grew to love his relationship with his students. His role as a scientist was equally rewarding. As I mentioned before, he was really fascinated with studying the spectra of light from stars. He was also fascinated by binary stars. He was fascinated by supernova. And he did a lot of work on all three of those fields that remains really relevant to astronomy today. And then the UFO work, I would almost say that if I had to rank the three careers, I would say teaching and science tied for number one, and UFOs a close second, because the UFO career was so problematic and so stressful, and there was always fighting involved. If he wasn't fighting his superiors at the Air Force, he was fighting other UFO researchers who felt that he wasn't doing enough to promote the cause. He was fighting the media, who were prone to misquote him and oversimplify the things that he said. So I would say that of the three careers, the UFO research was the biggest hassle. And I don't know if the rewards ever fully compensated Hynek for the hassle and grief that he experienced in that profession.
You mentioned public fights, and this going back to the other name in that S folder, which is Carl Sagan, which I think most people will recognize that name as being a kind of preeminent voice in astronomy, and he was kind of big in SETI, the search for extraterrestrial life. What was their relationship like, Carl Sagan and Dr. Hynek?
Well, I got to see a lot of correspondence between the two scientists, and it's pretty fascinating because their relationship had two sides. On the one side, They had a very courteous and respectful relationship as fellow scientists who were interested in studying some of the same problems. And so there's a lot of correspondence between the two of them in which they're simply exchanging ideas and data about a particular branch of astronomy that they're both interested in at that time. So there's the one level of their relationship, but when it came to Hynek's work with UFOs, the relationship shifted dramatically. Sagan had been on record since the 50s and 60s as being very sarcastic and demeaning towards anyone who said that they saw a UFO or anyone who felt that UFOs were worthy of serious scientific study. So that means that Dr. Hynek was a target of a lot of Dr. Sagan's sarcasm and criticism. And as Sagan said in a TV news special in the 1960s, he typified UFO witnesses as cultists, and he said that this was a sign that us weak humans had to have some sort of constant reassurance that there were men in white robes somewhere out in the sky ready to help us when we got into trouble. That's how Dr. Sagan described UFO witnesses. He was very, very sarcastic towards them. So this tension between Dr. Hynek and Dr. Sagan as regards the UFO phenomenon went public a number of times, which I document in the book. And the two of them had some really fascinating and really frustrating exchanges. Hynek was soft-spoken. He wasn't always very assertive in stating his case and making his points. Dr. Sagan, on the other hand, was very glib. He had a very smooth tongue. He was very, very good at arguing his points and throwing around a lot of serious shade at people who he didn't really agree with. And of course, this came to a head as I describe in the book at a futurism conference that they both attended in 1975. And here's how I found out about it. I pulled that Sagan file out from the file cabinet at the CUFOS headquarters, and I find a letter that Dr. Hynek had written to Dr. Sagan in advance of a public appearance they were going to be making together. And in this letter, Dr. Hynek essentially is saying, can we please call a truce? Just for this one day when we're both going to be at this event, can we please call a truce and not argue about UFOs? Just stick to the things we agree upon. Can we please do that? And I saw that letter and just thought, oh my gosh, there is a story here. But then it got very frustrating because I could not find any follow-up correspondence between the two of them. And I couldn't find any record of this public appearance that they made together until I was about 1 month away from my publisher's deadline. And I was desperate to finish this storyline. And that was the day that the archivist said, hey, Mark, we've got this new collection of the Daily Northwestern there that you should look through. And when I looked through those hundreds of mentions of Hynek's name, that's where I started to find some of the details of this public appearance they made together, and ended up finding that one reporter had written up this meeting in an obscure UFO magazine in 1980. And in the miracle of our world today, of course, I go on eBay looking for this 1980 obscure UFO magazine and find that, lo and behold, someone has it for sale on eBay for like $7. So a few days later, I have this vintage UFO magazine in my midst, and I've got this blow-by-blow description of this public appearance. And it was brutal. Carl Sagan just ripped Hynek to shreds. And basically, in my opinion, Sagan's position is really, really hard to defend intellectually. Because as you mentioned, Sagan was one of the founding members of the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence Foundation, the SETI Foundation. He absolutely believed that there was intelligent life elsewhere in the universe. He even went so far as to admit that those intelligent life forms may have visited the Earth. But then he became very arbitrary about it and said, but that only could have happened millions of years ago. There's no reason to believe they'd be visiting us now. And his attitude was that if you say they're visiting us now, then you're an idiot. And that's pretty much how he treated Dr. Hynek. So, and Dr. Hynek would just sit there and say, well, but we have cases that are very convincing, and Dr. Sagan would just come back and say, well, I want to see your good cases. So Sagan would say, well, the only way you can make your case is to show us a good case, show us a good UFO event, a good UFO report, but I get to decide what makes it a good report or not. So that was the kind of trickery that Carl Sagan used to win his arguments with Dr. Hynek. Very, very frustrating.
This is an oversimplification, maybe of way of putting it, but if Dr. Hynek is the hero of this book, is Dr. Sagan the one of the villains?
Yeah, and there were several villains, but Dr. Sagan was the most interesting and appealing for a lot of reasons. Number one, because he's the best known of all the villains in the story. And number two, just because the nature of his villainy was so fascinating to me. Because here's what I didn't mention in my last comments. Here's the thing: what it all came down to in the end, although Dr. Sagan tried to make it seem that this was an argument over scientific philosophy or lack thereof, what it all really came down to was money. And Dr. Sagan admitted that in a couple of the conversations that I chronicle in my book. Sagan would always at the end say, well, we shouldn't be spending money on UFO research. We should be spending it on my research into planetary science. So disappointingly, it's not about scientific philosophy. It's just about cash. I was very disappointed to find out that was what was really driving Carl Sagan's antipathy towards Dr. Hynek and towards the UFO phenomenon. He really felt that every penny spent on UFO research was a penny less that he would get for his own planetary research.
Now, you mentioned a couple times about some of the various things that you've done for research, and I think you said in the acknowledgments of your book that I think you spent about 4 years on this project. So you obviously went deep on this, and not only is the book a lot about Hynek, it's also about, you also write a lot about the cases and kind of detail some of the cases to explain his reactions to them. And so I'm just kind of curious, like, you spent a lot of time on this project. What was, I mean, 4 years is a long time to dedicate to anything. I mean, you should maybe end up with like a college degree at the end of it, in 4 years. What was the process of writing this book like for you?
Oh my gosh. Well, I decided very early on that there were a couple of things I wanted to try to do with the book. I already mentioned one, and that was looking at Hynek's various careers, not just his UFO work. I wanted a well-rounded look at who he really was as a man and how his different fields of endeavor, influenced each other. So that was number one. The other part was I also wanted the book to be sort of a UFOs 101. I knew that this book would not be just for UFO fans. It also had to be for people who were maybe casually interested in the phenomenon but didn't know a whole lot about it and didn't really know a whole lot about its history. So I wanted the book to be sort of a guide to those readers to the history of the UFO phenomenon and how it has affected modern science and how it's affected pop culture in so many ways. So those were my two big objectives when I started working on the book. And so that dictated my research. Obviously, a great deal of research went into, Hynek's life and Hynek's career, but then also a great deal of research went into studying and reporting on these watershed UFO events. And since I had been so fascinated with this topic all my life, it was really thrilling to sort of go back to these big UFO cases that I thought I was well versed on, and to really start digging in and doing some research, and finding out that these cases were a lot more complex and a lot more interesting than I gave them credit for. And I would always look to three things. I would look to, first of all, the witnesses' original statements as presented in the media and in Air Force investigations. Then I would look for the Air Force investigators or the UFO investigators' descriptions of how they investigated the case. And thirdly, then I would look at how Dr. Hynek described his involvement with the case. So looking at all of these UFO events from those three different angles, I was able to. I felt I was able to really really describe and understand those events in a way that hadn't really been done before in a UFO book. So those are my goals. I think I've come pretty close to accomplishing them. And it was really fascinating. Like I said, there were so many things that I thought I knew pretty well, and found out that I didn't really know very well at all. Like the swamp gas case. It was a big moment in Hynek's career. He described it as the low point in his career, and I can understand why. There was a high-profile case in March of 1966 in southeastern Michigan, a mass sighting that took place over several nights and involved well over 100 witnesses, including law enforcement officers, college professors, college students, a civil defense agent, all these people who were seeing lights in and around swampy areas in Michigan over the course of a couple nights. And the stories were very widely reported. It became a national story in no time. And Hynek was called upon by his Air Force superiors to go to Michigan and basically put a lid on this case. They wanted Hynek, in no uncertain terms, they wanted Hynek to come up with a prosaic, natural explanation for these sightings. Otherwise, it would be too big an embarrassment to the Air Force to have to admit that they didn't know what was going on. So, Hynek arrives in Michigan. He spends 3 days interviewing all these multiple witnesses, and he's facing pressure from the Air Force to wrap this up quickly. He's facing pressure from his UFO colleagues, who are all convinced that this is the big one, that with so many witnesses, that there is no doubt that these people really saw what many believed were spaceships from another planet. So Hynek's facing this pressure on both sides. Meanwhile, he's not coming up with any concrete answers. He's not coming up with any answers that satisfy him. There's no consistency to the reports, or very little consistency to the reports. He's unable to interview all the witnesses, even though there were over 100 of them. He's only able to interview about a handful of the witnesses. So he's really stymied in his investigation, and then his Air Force boss forces him to have a press conference after 3 days. And at the press conference, Hynek just leads off by saying, although I can't prove it in a court of law, I think it's very possible that these people saw swamp gas. Well, you can imagine the furor. All these people are out there believing that Hynek's just about to announce that there's proof of aliens visiting us from another world, and instead he says swamp gas. He just shocked everyone, and the entire population of the state of Michigan was furious with him because they all felt that he was calling them a bunch of kooks. That wasn't what he was saying at all, but that's how it was interpreted, and that's how it was reported in the media. And so Hynek just became this pariah. Everyone was furious with him, from the Air Force on down. Everyone was furious with Hynek for messing up the whole thing. And it led to a congressional hearing called by former President Gerald Ford, who at the time was a congressman from that district in Michigan. So the swamp gas case was really a big, big moment in Hynek's career. And it was at that moment where he finally, after years and years of doubt and questioning, finally, ultimately decided he was no longer going to play the game by the Air Force's rules. So it was a big, big moment in Hynek's career for a lot of reasons.
It really just speaks to the complicated nature of that work. I mean, there's basically no answers, and then sometimes you have to say there isn't an answer, and obviously people are looking to somebody to find the answers, and this guy's getting paid or endorsed by the Air Force to figure out an answer.
Right. Well,
yeah.
The I guess the point of this story, going back to your initial question, is that this was a big surprise to me that I ended up, after doing all the research on this particular case, I ended up agreeing with Hynek that it was probably, or very likely, swamp gas. All the evidence points to that. So Hynek was just being intellectually honest, and I found his verdict to be actually rather convincing. It does fit the facts, and now when I go out to give talks, like tomorrow I'm going to be giving a presentation at the Milwaukee Paranormal Conference, And in my public presentations and in my book, I support Hynek on the swamp gas verdict. I say, yeah, I think he was right to say that. I think that was the absolute right thing, the absolute correct conclusion for him to reach. And UFO people are still annoyed by that. I've had experiences where I've expressed my approval of the swamp gas verdict to UFO audiences, and there's kind of just a dead silence from the crowd. Like, wait a minute, what are you saying? You're not supposed to say that. It's really an interesting phenomenon, but I absolutely believe. And I thought the swamp gas thing was a joke when I started researching the case. Okay, researching this case changed my mind, much in the same way it changed Hynek's. So it's very weird how all of this stuff plays out.
No, as we were mentioning, you've read a lot of his letters, a lot of his papers. Hynek wrote 3 books about UFOs in his lifetime. I'm just kind of wondering what you make of him, because obviously you didn't get to interview him because he died in 1986. I'm just kind of like wondering what you make of him as a writer and just as an intellect.
I have immense respect for the guy. There was a lot going on in his head. And there were several moments in researching his life that were really, really eye-opening moments for me. One of them was a lot of UFO people think of him as a coward. He was a toady for the Air Force. He gets accused of this all the time. But back in 1952, in the very, very early days of his career, and his career with the Air Force investigating the UFO phenomenon, he actually went in front of a group of scientists. This is a professional gathering of his colleagues, and he's kind of a relative nobody in 1952. And he delivers a paper to this conference, and he basically says, all you people who make fun of UFOs, stop doing it. This is something worthy of our attention. It's worthy of study. And he had this fantastic quote where he said, ridicule is not a part of the scientific method, and the public should not be taught that it is. And I was really struck by that comment. It told me so much about Hynek as a scientist and as a human being. His commitment to stick slavishly only to what the facts could tell him and not go 1 millimeter beyond what the facts could back up. And just the fact that he was able to see, he was able to look at the phenomenon from the human side, from the angle of we shouldn't be ridiculing people who come forward and say that they've had these unusual experiences and encounters. We should take them seriously. We should treat them with respect. So there's a lot about the guy. There was another moment where, as I was pouring through his correspondence at Northwestern, after the swamp gas incident that I just described, even though a lot of people were really furious with Hynek, he started getting an immense amount of fan mail in the wake of the swamp gas incident. He became instantly recognizable as the world's leading expert on UFOs, and he was getting letters sent to him at Northwestern from people all around the world who were saying, hey, Dr. Hynek, I'd love to tell you about this UFO experience I had, or hey, Dr. Hynek, I have this new theory of reality that I'd like to share with you. I mean, these letters were just wild and crazy and all over the place, and all handwritten, many of them multiple pages long. And I was reading these letters and thinking, oh my gosh, how could anybody be getting this kind of mail and remain sane? And then I started finding his responses to these people, and his responses were amazing. He never, ever, ever lost patience with anyone or treated anyone as if they were being stupid or completely off base or wrong-headed. He responded to all of these letters with great patience and great respect. He took these people's claims and stories seriously, and he treated them the way he wanted to be treated. And I was so struck by that. And I also discovered in this process that a lot of the return correspondence was handled by Hynek's assistant, a gentleman named Bill Powers. And I was lucky enough to track down Bill and interview him just a couple months before he passed away. And I asked Bill about these letters. I said, how could you and Alan be so patient with these people who were sending you some really, really wild stories in their letters? said, how are you always so unfailingly kind and polite and respectful to these people? And Bill just kind of chuckled, and he said, well, Ellen and I both believe that, if somebody had an idea to share or a story to tell, they deserve to be listened to. And it was just that simple. That was their philosophy, and I just took that on as my guiding philosophy as I wrote the book. And I think it's one of the best things ever said about UFO study that I've ever come across.
After writing this book, researching this book, and also your previous work, kind of investigating UFO experiences, what's kind of your current position on belief or not belief, or because I think a lot of history books will look back on the 1950s and 60s and kind of relate the sightings, the flying saucer craze to the Sputnik incident and Americans' fears over the Cold War. But I'm just kind of curious, like, what is your kind of take on it, or your opinion on it?
Well, I think that very often when people try to have serious discussions about the UFO phenomenon, they get hung up on what it is. They get hung up on, is it a nuts and bolts phenomenon? Are these actual spacecraft from another world? And if so, how do we prove it? Will we ever find any physical evidence? Will we ever find like a broken off piece of metal from a flying saucer? And the conversation just gets bogged down in stuff like that, which we've learned from the past several decades. Those conversations never lead anywhere, sad to say. And yet a lot of people still engage in that kind of conversation constantly, which I find frustrating. I think a more fruitful way to look at it is to talk about what UFOs mean. What do they mean to us personally? What do they mean to us as a society, as a race? Why do we need to have these stories as part of our pop culture and part of our, part of our basic cultural language? I think that's a far more interesting and far more fruitful way to approach the phenomenon. I know that doesn't appeal to a whole lot of people because it doesn't really answer the questions they want answered. So it does lead to some frustration, but to me, that's kind of the only way to go. I come down on, I think it's Hynek would say that he just thinks whatever the true explanation for UFOs is, that it's just going to be something just beyond our understanding of the universe, and it's something that is just going to knock our socks off. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a vehicle from another planet.
Why do you feel like you personally have been drawn to this subject matter throughout the course of your life? I think I've read you say that you grew up watching Star Trek, and that made a big dent on your life. And some of the science fiction work throughout, your early life kind of piqued your interest. But what has kind of kept it as something that you can't shake, or that you want to continue to explore?
I really wish I knew. It's a very hard question to answer. I mean, I can tell you when my fascination began. I've told this story like 100 times in the last few months. When I was 3.5 years old, in 1963, a new TV show premiered called The Outer Limits, and it was all about aliens and monsters from space. And for some strange reason, that show was on when it premiered. That show was on our TV in our rec room. And when this glowing alien monster appeared, I was so terrified that I ran upstairs and hid behind the corner, and I wouldn't come out again until the monster went away. And that's literally my first conscious memory. So it goes all the way back to then. And for some reason, being terrified of this alien monster turned into a fascination with all things alien and UFO and related to space and space travel and astronomy. It's always been there. It always will be. I can't really explain it except to point to that one moment of seeing the monster on the Outer Limits.
I feel like I could talk to you all day, but I probably got to let you go. Is there anything that you want to leave people with about the book? Well,
I think it's important to keep in mind what Hynek came to realize late in life, which was that his entire life was dedicated to essentially solving the mystery of UFOs. And late in life, when he realized that that wasn't going to happen, he wasn't going to solve the riddle in any way that had any finality or closure. He was okay with that. He was okay with that, and I think that's something I would like people to take away from the book, is that you can be interested in this phenomenon, you can be interested in these events, and they can be fascinating and intriguing, even if we never are able to understand why they're happening or what they mean. I think that's something I would like to have readers take away from the book, is that we don't have to have an ultimate final explanation of what it's all about in order to appreciate the phenomenon and to be fascinated by it, because it does shape so much of our pop culture and our modern science. Just referring back to Star Trek, there are untold numbers of scientists and engineers at NASA working on our space program who grew up watching Star Trek and became enamored of space science because of its hopeful vision of the future, and because of its view of this unlimited potential of the human race. And I'd like to think that the UFO phenomenon also has a similar effect on us in some weird way that we may not understand yet. So I think that's the big takeaway I would like people to have.
Great thanks to Mark for taking the time to talk. I had a lot of questions I didn't get to, so maybe I'll have to have him back on the show sometime. Make sure to check out his book, The Close Encounters Man. And again, he'll be appearing at the Wisconsin Book Festival in Madison on November 4th at the Wisconsin Institutes for Discovery. Don't forget to subscribe to the Wisconsin Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play. You can stay in the loop about the pod by visiting wispod.com and following the show on Twitter at wispodcast and on Facebook at the Wisconsin Podcast. Cheers.